Hello and welcome to India's World. The United Kingdom will hold a referendum on Thursday, June 23rd, to decide whether Britain should leave or remain in the European Union. British Prime Minister David Cameron had promised during his 2015 general election campaign that if he won, he would hold a referendum on the issue of Brexit or British exit from the EU. This was largely to appease a section of his own Conservative Party, as well as the UK Independence Party or UKIP, which argued that Britain had not had a say since 1975 when it had voted to stay in the EU in a referendum. And the EU had changed since then, and therefore the Brits needed to have a say once again. Now, virtually on the eve of the referendum, a declaration at the G7 meeting in Japan last weekend has warned that a vote by the UK to leave the European Union would pose a serious threat to global growth. The G7 industrialized countries have said that a UK exit from the EU would reverse the trend of increased global trade, investment and job creation. Today we are discussing the consequences of Brexit for the EU, the UK and of course India. My guests today are Ambassador Dinkar Khullar. He was India's ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg and European Union. He was also ambassador to Azerbaijan and Austria and permanent representative of India to UN offices and international organizations in Vienna. Ambassador Aftab Seth, a renowned diplomat. He's been India's ambassador to Vietnam, Japan and Greece. And we also have with us Professor Manoj Pant, an old friend of mine. He's professor at the Center for Trade and Development at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Professor Pant, let me begin with you. Do you agree with the G7 statement about Britain exiting EU impacting global growth? What will be the consequences of Brexit on global economic growth and why?
No, I don't think economics is the issue here. That's the one being used to sort of tell people don't vote in favor of exiting. I believe, which I'm sure will come up later, that politics is a bigger issue here than economics. Economics is issue very simple. As far as the UK is concerned, from what I've seen last, roughly about 44% of the trade of UK is with EU, and largely two countries. One is Holland because of the finance issue, and the other is Germany. So it's not as if it's going to make a big difference, nor has trade of UK with the EU expanded phenomenally after they become part of EU. So, RTAs don't actually lead to trade. They are actually consequences of trade. They are sort of de facto rationalizing what's happening to it. So I don't think the worry for the G7 that the world economy is going to collapse. The worry is more what the UK exit does for other countries, which I can talk about later.
But we'll come to that in a bit. Ambassador Khullar, how much of a cataclysmic event would Brexit be for European Union, or would it make no difference?
No, it will be a very important development. It's reflected in the fact that in February this year, the Europeans went out of their way to give concessions to Cameron to enable them to strengthen their position in the referendum. Britain is very, very important politically to the European Union. It is, after all, a UN Security Council member. And it punches much above its weight within the European Union as well. So I don't think politically the Europeans would be in any way happy with a Brexit.
Ambassador Seth, will there be no economic consequences? There will be political consequences, but how will the EU manage to overcome the current economic problems it's already facing within the EU and minimize the consequences of Brexit, the economic consequences of British exit?
Well, the people in Britain who are in favor of leaving the EU cite certain economic problems, particularly immigration. There's less than 1 million East Europeans, the Polish plumber, which is held up as the great bogey who's invading Britain and taking away jobs. And there's close to about 800,000 West Europeans working in Britain. And of course, a little under 3 million Indians and Chinese and other Asians. So the fear that is being expressed is that jobs are being taken. But there's a contrary view that these immigrants coming are hardworking, young, and they're actually contributing to the British economy. So there's two sides of it as far as the economic consequences of the exit are concerned.
But that's on Britain. So, Manoj, what will be the economic consequences for EU, or are you saying that there are no economic consequences?
I don't think so, because remember, there are a number of other members, so to speak, of EU, out of those 28, who are not really full EU members. Norway is one. Denmark, many immigration laws don't apply to Denmark. Switzerland now has a new status. They are part of single market, but they are not part of EU. So just moving out of EU, what it means in terms of the clauses is something which is not clear yet. Now let me tell you one thing, the economics. Where the real, I think those who are in favor of exit in UK are arguing is, they say, look, we can't go any further. Our trade in the last 5 years is not expanding with EU, but on services. Secondly, we are trading now more with emerging countries. Third, EU is so slow in going through any trade agreements because every one of the 28 has a veto. So it takes so long that they're unable to negotiate any trade deal with emerging countries like India, and they are not allowed to till that. Okay. So they feel that it sort of cramps their style. Okay. And they feel maybe we need to move out. But I think the other implications are bigger.
Yeah, okay. So what's the process, Ambassador Khullar, of leaving the EU? Is it correct that Article 50, once it is triggered, there's no turning back? You can't opt out after that. Then the whole process takes place. And during that process, the UK will be excluded from all key decision making, including the final vote, and it leaves the EU in charge of the timetable, a 2-year timetable for its exit. And the UK will be then presented with a take it or leave it deal. So is it possible that the UK could leave EU without first getting itself a preferential trade agreement?
I don't think so. They will have to negotiate it. That's the 2-year period that is there. And after 2 years, it automatically, once they declare it, then after 2 years, automatically, irrespective of whether a deal has been reached or not, they are out. But frankly, I think that it's in the interests of the Europeans and UK to find an arrangement. Just for clarification, Norway is not a member of the EU. But Norway and Switzerland, as Professor Pant rightly pointed out, have deals to be part of the economic area. Yep. So that can be negotiated by the Europeans with the UK. But frankly, if the UK opts out, the negotiations are going to be very difficult. The Europeans will feel very much as if they have done a deal with them and yet they have let them down.
Okay, so we're going to discuss some of the various models that might be available to the UK to still deal with the EU and still engage with it in a bit. But we need to take a break at this point. We'll be back soon. Don't go away. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing the consequences of a possible British exit from the EU or Brexit. Manoj, let's take the worst case scenario that Britain fails to strike a trade deal with the rest of the EU before exiting it, does not pursue a free trade agenda and becomes protectionist. There is a real fear that they will become protectionists. What might happen to the British economy? Because there are some estimates which suggest that if this is the scenario, then British GDP will shrink by about 2.2% by 2030.
See, irrespective of the EU, if the UK, which is by and large a small country, except for oil, was to become protectionist, their GDP will shrink anyway. Because right now their biggest asset today is their oil and their services, financial services, not the other things. So that will happen irrespective of EU. But well, let me disagree on the first part. I don't think they will stop trading. Let me explain. Even if they leave the EU, they have, they are already part of the EEA, European Economic Area, which is really all they call it the single market. All the single market requires, everyone must have harmonized the standards so we don't waste too much time trying to figure out which product has come, all those. That they've already done. Why would they undo that? So there are countries like Norway, Switzerland does that. Switzerland also have movement of people from Germany to Switzerland for jobs and vice. So the EU is more, UK's decision to leave the EU is more a political thing to me than economic. And I think that's where I believe they are making a big mistake. And the second issue, if I can just sort of flag it right now, is they must worry, or the EU must worry, that there are many people in the EU waiting to say, look, the UK has done it, let's try it. The Italians are ready. There's a group in the Germans who are ready. So there are a whole lot of people saying, why are we in? Now this goes back to the eternal contradictions of EU, beginning from expansion 1527. That's the issue.
No, but quickly, I know since you're the only economist here, what is the best case scenario for the UK then?
You mean after leaving the EU?
After leaving the EU.
Well, they would continue in the kind of relationship that Norway or others have with the EU. They would continue to trade with the EU. They would be part of that same single market. They would also be part of the same single market in terms of movement of labor. All that will happen is every single decision of the European Parliament will not be binding on EU. And the social charter of the EU will not always be binding on EU. That's all.
So, Bharat, do you agree with our economist friend here that economically there will hardly be any impact of Brexit? That there are alternative mechanisms possible, they will come into play and nothing will change?
Absolutely. You see, this European Economic Area, which Manoj Pant talked about, which Norway is a part of, that they have access, but agriculture, fisheries,
That's right.
and EU laws don't apply. Now, the biggest bogey, the phobia amongst the little Englanders, to use a 19th century phrase, and those who favor splendid isolation, is the creeping EU laws which are undermining the sovereignty of British Parliament.
That's the issue.
Now that is protected because, so as he says, the economic consequences will be minimal, but what they're really worried about is this creeping EU legislation.
But they help formulate that legislation. So why are they scared of this creeping legislation which they themselves help formulate?
You know, it's the little Englanders, the SMEs, the people who are the blue-collar workers, who are the farmers for Britain, the Muslims for Britain, various gay rights organizations who are afraid that this legislation will impinge on the sovereignty of the British Parliament.
Yeah. When they formulated the laws, the world was a booming economy, 70s and all. The recession has been so long, and the UK is in really bad shape. So, see, in a bad time, blame who you can blame. So, who to blame? Blame the rest of EU, which is not the problem. Okay. But that's how easy it is.
Mr. Khullar, is the single market framework only option available to EU, or are there other options? For example, the Swiss option is not a single market option. It includes better access to financial services. It includes a role in formulating rules and standards in EU. They could follow a model of unilateral liberalization, irrespective of what you and others are doing. Minimum negotiations with EU, but you negotiate with a lot of other countries and liberalize. Or you could follow a strategy of agreeing to a series of free trade agreements with the EU as well as other states. So there are 4 or 5 options. Which one will they choose if they exit?
I think the simplest option will be to go to EFTA, the European Free Trade Agreement, of which Norway is a part. That will be a very easy option for them to take if they have problems in negotiating with Brussels. But I think one of the biggest economic problems which they may face, I think, is for what they call the City of London, the finance. If Britain exits, Frankfurt can emerge even more dominantly as the financial market for outsiders. Basically means Asians, Americans would look rather than to City of London, but to Frankfurt. This is worrying the financial sector. I think this has been referred to earlier. And I think this will have a major influence on the final decision, because that's also a major employment generator in the UK.
Absolutely. Now, we're going to discuss how Brexit will impact India, but before that, how would it impact the United States? Because President Obama has been warning Britain against exiting EU and saying that don't think that signing treaties even with your strongest alliance partners is going to be easy. What did he mean by that?
Well, you know, ever since the early part of the 20th century, there has been this link between the United States and Britain. In fact, Winston Churchill said, if you have to choose between Europe and the open sea, choose the open sea. So the open sea means the United States. And the United States, as far as I can see, is particularly worried that an exit of Britain will diminish their stature as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and as an important member of NATO, a producer of weapons and a contributor to NATO's activities in Europe and around the world.
Okay. Manoj, would there be members of EU who would be happy to see Britain leave the EU and say good riddance?
Yeah, it's easy to find that out, although there are surveys going on now too. If you go back to the formation of the EU, even 93, the French, of course, believe they are the God's chosen race on earth. So they believe that, the French and the Germans could never stand each other, but neither could stand the Americans. French, Germans could also not stand UK, but all three of them could stand the Americans even less. So that's how EU formed. So obviously today, France is very interested in UK leaving. They've always had a problem with the English language and its domination. They would be happy. And as far as I know, the worry to me, if Brexit ever happens, would be these other countries where the same movements are coming.
Yeah, you've said
and
that.
And they are going back. So that's the biggest danger.
But the Germans would be unhappy to see...
Germans are unhappy.
Okay.
The French would be extremely happy.
Right.
And the Italians, frankly, couldn't care less one way or the other.
All right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again soon. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the consequences of Brexit for the world and for India. Ambassador Khullar, how would Brexit impact India, considering that EU is India's largest trading partner ahead of China and the US?
I don't think there'll be a significant impact on India-EU relations out of this, for the simple reason that India-EU relations are not directed through London. They are, in fact, dominantly through continental Europe. So I don't see a significant impact. In fact, contrary to the general perception on trade agreements becoming easier or more difficult, India's greatest difficulty in negotiating an EU trade agreement has come from Britain, because on our positive side, what we're looking for was on the IT sector, and on the IT sector, the single country blocking us has always been the UK.
Yeah.
So the question of are being affected seriously doesn't arise. I also do not buy into the theory of some of the people who are pro-Brexit, that it'll be easier for them to negotiate a trade agreement with India outside the EU.
Yep.
I don't buy that.
So let me take that question to you, Ambassador Seth. Would a post-Brexit UK be able to secure greater cooperation with India than it already has? And why should it be like that?
I don't think, I agree with Dinkar Khullar. I don't think so. You see, the diaspora in Britain is now so important in the internal politics of Britain that I don't think, and they are already shaping British policy towards us in a way that is in our favor. And now you have South Asian as a mayor of London. What greater example could there be of the fact that we are a very integral part of Britain now, we meaning the South Asian group of people. And I don't think there's going to be any great difference in their relationship with us, either on the student front or on the trade front.
Okay, so Manoj, so they'll keep blocking the EU, they've been blocking the EU trade agreement, as Dinkar says.
Right. No,
but after EU, would they allow IT professionals to go there?
No, see, I'll tell you, he's right about that. Now, I'm not point. I'm saying from their point of view, it's not only India. Don't forget the biggest bull in the China shop, China. The Chinese also, they have the same. It's the terms and conditions of the EU is such that the UK cannot negotiate a separate agreement. Like in ASEAN, those countries can negotiate separate, but the EU structure does not allow it. It's just a negative thing. Now, whether their leaving will allow them to make a better deal with India, I don't know. I don't know if there are factors that we can bring into, for example, foreign investment as a trade-off for services trade. So it's possible. I do believe that they are restricted under the EU system. Whether they will separately negotiate one with India, I think they would. And I think the major source will be India's foreign investment in the UK, which is not as inconsequential as we think it is. But is that a reason for leaving Brexit, for leaving the EU? No, I don't think so.
Absolutely. Ambassador Khullar, there's an argument that in order to be competitive outside the EU, Britain would have to have a liberal immigration policy, which is what you pointed to earlier. However, those who want to leave the EU, their main argument is limit immigration. Okay, so they're pushing Britain in a direction that is contrary to what would lead to growth. Now, under these circumstances, how would restricting immigration to UK, if that happens or comes about in a more sort of direct fashion, in a more intense fashion, impact the movement of Indian professionals to UK?
It will certainly impact the movement of Indian professionals to UK. We've already witnessed the problems that we've had as part of EU. It will increase in the face of the opposition that is now coming to the whole question of immigration. But returning to the point you began with, the fact is that it will harm their economy. They need the immigrants. It's like the rest of Europe. They can complain about all the immigrants that they have, but they need them. Polish plumbers you don't like, but the Polish plumbers are a necessity for you because others aren't doing the plumbing. In most of Europe, in large parts of Germany, for instance, the working class who do major professional jobs are Turks. On a weekend, you can't get anyone except Turk or Indian to work in your house. That's the scenario there. So they need immigrants. I think this is the mistaken notion that the Europeans are living in, that will keep out the immigrants. They need immigrants very much to keep their economies, sustain their economic growth.
And quick addition, and also to keep the population stable.
Well, we'll leave that issue. Master State, the Secretary General of FICCI said in a press release that the British decision to, or a possible British decision to leave the EU would create considerable uncertainty for Indian businesses and would possibly have an adverse impact on investment. Is that a significant concern?
Well, before I answer that, let me just add a dimension to this immigration problem. We're overlooking the terrorism problem. And one of the arguments within Britain for leaving the EU is that the EU laws on terrorism are lax and it is not adequate protection for Britain. And as Dinkar said, you can enter the EU from Greece, you can get into Germany, but it's not all that easy for immigrants and crypto terrorists, guys in the guise of immigrants entering Britain. So that is one of the main arguments for exiting is terrorism, and ISIS is a major thing, a shadow across the whole of Europe, including Britain. So about FICCI, I'm going to pass that
Manoj,
on to
I was going to move to
my
you,
friend Manoj.
Do you think Indian investment will be impacted by
No,
Brexit?
I don't think so. Because typically the argument is if you invest in one part of a regional grouping, because you want access to the markets, that access to markets will not stop. Because if you look at it, even suppose the EU was to leave, suppose the UK was to leave the EU, what kind of duties do they face? 2.3%, 2.2%. How does it matter? It's not that they can't trade, and they already have harmonized their standards in EU. Why should they change? So I don't think it should matter.
One last question. Prime Minister Modi had called UK as India's entry point to the European Union. Now, it is not. You know it and I know it. UK is not the entry point to the European Union. But this was interpreted in the British press as India suggesting that India would be happy if Britain didn't leave the European Union. Is that a reasonable conclusion to draw from his statement, or you think this is just the kind of rhetoric world leaders use when they visit each other?
I think this is part. I would tend to take the view that this is part of rhetoric. If you're sitting in the UK, you would say that you are our entry into the EU. London is not our entry into EU. We have an independent entry into London, whether they're part of EU or they're not part of EU. Just a point to make for the record is that this is not the first exit that will take place from the EU. Sure. Greenland has exited earlier. Greenland had exited many years ago.
With no consequences?
No. Well, Greenland had no major consequence. They remain an overseas territory of Denmark. But I think there's more to do with fisheries policies and things like that. It was largely linked to that. But the exit took place, and I don't recall it ever hitting the Indian press.
All right. Okay, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank Professor Manoj Pant, Ambassador Aftab, Seth, Ambassador Dinkar, Khullar for participating in this discussion. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Till then, goodbye, and thanks for watching India's World.